Hello there, I'm Fintusius and today we'll be looking at DPS classes and their specs in the Shadowlands pre-patch and comparing their relative performance in raiding and Mythic Plus based on data taken from warcraftlogs.com and Raider.io, now that a sample of about 2 weeks has been gathered. As a bonus, I'll also be giving you a quick guide and summary made in cooperation with top players from those specs, so that you might know what are their big changes in the pre-patch as well as how to play them optimally if you'd like to check them out and possibly getting used to a potential new main for Shadowlands. Before we get to that, however, there's a few important things I need to say beforehand. Firstly, no matter the current performance of your preferred spec, please know that you can easily clear Mythic plus 20 and higher keys or clear the Mythic Nyalotha raid with any class and spec combo in the game, as these rankings are just performance comparisons between specs on paper. Since the sample is taken from just 2 weeks of pre-patch, the less popular specs have a lot less recorded encounters or dungeon runs, making it not as precise as it could potentially be. And with encounters lasting much shorter than they once did, which oddly is a familiar feeling, some specs may look worse than they really are. The bottom line is that before you get discouraged, please remember that you can easily clear all of the high-end content you want with any spec if you'd like to. Secondly, you'll be seeing on screen things such as stat priorities. While that general rule remains correct for most specs, the thing you should be aware of is that with the pre-patch now live, there is a new hidden diminishing return on secondary stats in Shadowlands, making stacking a single stat not as good as it used to be. This means that, for example, let's say that for a player A Retribution Paladin, Critical Strike might be his best secondary stat to pursue, while for another Retribution Paladin player B, it might actually be Haste. What I'm trying to say is that you should not take those stat priorities and follow them blindly if you'd like to get the most out of your character's performance. Instead, you should be simming yourself with the right talents and settings with tools such as the Simulation Craft add-on or raid bot stat weights and quick sim options. It's actually pretty simple to do, but if you'd like to, I'll cover how to go about it in another video. Lastly, please remember that all this pre-patch data is not indicative of how balance will look like in Shadowlands or the future Castle Nathria raid, due to the current lack of systems such as legendaries, leveling upgrades, conduits, soulbinds, and covenant abilities. With essences and Azerite traits still being present, please note that some specs benefit more from them than others, which is something that will not exist in Shadowlands. It is a wacky pre-patch period, so take everything you see with a grain of salt and let's get to it. Rejoice, fellow Frost DKs, as you're once again able to wield a two-hander. However, due to being locked out of leveling upgrades that heavily buffs the two-handed build, as those will become available at levels gained in Shadowlands, dual wielding for now is the most optimal way to play, but you can still make work a two-handed breath build if you'd like to. The loss of corruption led Frost Death Knights into the underperforming pack, especially in comparison to its Unholy brother, as its BFA power was tied mostly due to having lots of secondary stats. Fear not, your time should come when the expansion releases, as most of the great stuff is not available yet, so you'll have to survive that pre-patch time being a bit worse than others. For raids, you'll be wanting to go with a beloved or hated dual-wielding Breath of Sintragosa build, while for dungeons you should be looking at an ice cap variation with more sustained cleave DPS. I made a full video about Frost Death Knights on the channel, so you can watch that one if you'd like to see more details. Lastly, Anti-Magic Zone is back for all DK specs, and the Legion artifact ability of summoning Sintragosa is finally back baseline. They really shouldn't have removed that one in the first place. Unholy's rise to power in the pre-patch comes from the change to your mastery. Instead of only increasing shadow damage, it now increases both shadow and minion damage. And since your minion damage in the pre-patch is such a big portion of your overall DPS, it's a huge damage buff. Additionally, while this is a pre-patch limited time feature, thanks to Vision of Perfection, you are now able to align Apocalypse, Dark Transformation and Unholy Blight on a 45-second cooldown for extreme nuke setups, which is the reason why Unholy is amongst the winners of the pre-patch compared to its 8.3 performance. This Vision playstyle with a lot of Magus traits is the way to go for raids, while that build also performs very well on higher keys. The old playstyle setup of Festamite and Bursting Swords is still very good for dungeons. Go ahead and experiment with both while making Daddy Althas proud. As a demon hunter, you're probably not having that great of a time in the pre-patch. After having been so reliant on borrowed power, your performance took a big hit with the removal of corruption, and will have to wait for Shadowlands to be back on track, as you should be able to regain it with, yeah, you've guessed it, another batch of borrowed power. Additionally, aside from most of your toolkit being nerfed in comparison to its 8.3 version, there are a few talent changes which should make your gameplay feel a bit similar to how it felt in Legion. And no, I don't mean momentum. You will also largely have the same build for both Raiding and Mythic Plus. Lastly, you're still going to be stacking the Furious Gaze trait, which is now subject to stat diminishing returns, which is the main reason behind why currently haste is a bad stat in general. Fear not, however, as this trait will become a flat 10% haste baseline passive in Shadowlands that will not be subject to stat diminishing returns. Your vengeance will have to wait for now, as you're backed in not being so prepared. It might be time to have a look at your balanced Druid, as it's going to feel fresh in the pre-patch. Upon your arrival on Azeroth, aside from being greeted by potential add-on errors and Magni himself, you're going to notice a new Eclipse system alongside the return of an old friend, notably the old Starfall. This means that it actually might be possible to relive its glorious days in feathery fashion. Aside from that, Balanced Druid also got a bit more utility with Typhoon becoming baseline, which makes it possible to talent into Mass Entanglement, for example, granting you additional utility goodness. But ladies and gentlemen, that is not all, as with buffed affinity choices, you can now also have Ursol's Vortex if you were to choose the Restoration affinity. Overall, Balanced Druids are most definitely one of the winners of the pre-patch. And right, not to forget that Stampeding Roar became a class baseline rather than a Feral and Guardian spec specific ability. Going into the pre-patch, Ferals didn't get changed that much aside from the new Blood Talents and Berserk, which should be a refreshing change to the rotation to those that were used to it. While it received most of the same global goodies as Boomkins, they lost their Stampeding Roar uniqueness, which might be a problem in the future and lead to potentially even more bullying of the cute cat spec. And while Feral's primary AoE tool remains uncapped, which is a highly positive thing for this spec in regards to the potential future dungeon performance, it will be a tough battle between you and your star-falling chicken brothers and sisters. As of pre-patch, numbers-wise the spec is currently extremely undertuned, making it not look very good in terms of raw damage output in comparison to, well, any other spec. So keep that in mind if you were looking to top the meters without having to break a sweat. While BM Hunters were hit pretty hard in terms of their target cap by having both Beast Cleave and Multi-Shot capped at 6 total targets, as well as losing a big portion of their secondary stat due to the removal of Corruption, they remain extremely powerful tuning-wise in both Raids and Mythic Plus, alongside remaining the only ranged DPS in the game that can do 100% of its damage while moving. They received a couple of small changes in their specs, such as the removal of the GCD from Aspect of the Wild, but will eventually lead to a pre-patch gameplay that will feel quite similar to the 8.3 version, with an added kill shot into the mix, as it is now back baseline for all Hunter specs. So if you're looking to make some big DPS with a free last minute trip to the Vision of Perfection land before it finally goes away, it's a very strong pick for raids while being an absolute powerhouse for Mythic Plus in the pre-patch. While the philosophy of being a sniper hunter remains true for Marksmanship Hunters, there are quite a few changes to their abilities and talents which should make MM fans pretty happy. In BFA, you mostly just had a single build for most PvE content, assuming you even played the spec, but thanks to their Shadowlands changes, it is now possible to have multiple possible builds for single target, cleave and AoE scenarios, or even some extremely spiky burst setups for PvP, which will likely make Marksman Hunters much more competitive in the new expansion. To those that played Hunters for quite some time, you'll be happy to hear that, well, or not, that Explosive Shot is back as a mini cooldown in the form of an AoE burst and hits pretty hard, so it's not exactly the same as Wrath of the Lich King flashbacks. While they are currently inferior in terms of raw performance in comparison to their Beast Mastery brothers, you should definitely keep an eye out for them in the future, as roles are likely going to get reversed in Shadowlands, so checking out that spec right now might be a good idea, as I expect them to become pretty popular in the future. While survival is essentially unchanged, which comes as a good or bad news depending on which side you're on, there are a few tweaks to talents which won't heavily affect gameplay. The best part, however, is that the spec remains almost entirely excluded from target caps and doesn't rely on borrowed power as much, aside from loving the haste stat which makes him perform in the pre-patch quite decently, and that is if you actually saw one. They remain a melee hunter spec, which isn't a popular choice as most people expect to be playing a ranged character when choosing hunter. Even when they performed extremely well during Nighthold in Legion, they barely saw any play. As a bonus, you're now able to hot swap to a ranged weapon and use it with some basic ranged abilities if you were to be outside of melee range in an encounter. That is possibly a very niche scenario and sadly I doubt it will see a lot of play, but hey, I think it would be cool. And even though you're a melee spec, you're still going to be able to use kill shot just like the other hunter specs. This time around, Arcane is back with a bang, as it is currently quite strong in its single target niche. Mechanically, has always been the turret of mage specs with high single target burst damage and low mobility while casting. While the playstyle gameplay isn't going to feel a lot different than it was in BFA, and with your new ability called Touch of the Magi, you're able to make some very big bursts every 45 seconds, assuming you did a proper burst rotation setup. And spoiler alert, there's a lot of arcane missiles involved. You're still going to be the only DPS spec that cares about mana, as your gameplay is centered around it as a resource. But this time around, with some nice tweaks to a few talents and thanks to the mentioned touch ability, it looks like the spec can become viable in scenarios that aren't necessarily just a big single target fight without movement. And that spell, well, let's just say that it's really scary in PvP, as it's basically a new mark of a Luneth, which was the Legion artifact ability for Arcane, and very much did some solid pew pew in its time. After having reigned supreme in 8.3 and somehow dodged every single nerf thrown at them, or maybe that was because there weren't any, I don't really remember anymore. Fire mages have lost their performance superiority over, well, basically everybody. After having been carried by corruption, the loss of that made a big impact to the performance. It's possible that they might be a bit weaker in Shadowlands, as they are still performing decently thanks to the listed Dream's Essence and the Mechagon braces for big combustions. There are, however, a few new things for fire mages, and the main one is your Ignite Mastery. You'll now be spreading your ignites with the help of your new ability called Phoenix Flames, which should help you feel more in control of your damaging patterns and burst setups, which in my opinion makes for a cooler gameplay. As a bonus, let me add that in PvP, Greater Pyroblast is now on a 15-second cooldown, so you can say goodbye to the not engaging one ability spam gameplay. After living in the shadow of the fire spec in 8.3, Frost is back with a vengeance by having an outstanding comeback performance in the pre-patch, especially in Mythic Blast. There are, however, not many changes when it comes to the gameplay of the spec itself, so if you knew how to play Frost in BFA, you won't have to do a lot of relearning of your spec. The only significant change is how Winter's Chill works. Rather than being a short debuff affecting all spells hitting the target, it now lasts longer but only affects the next two spells you'll use. So ideally, these should be spent on 2 Ice Lances as it currently stands, but in theory, could also be used on Glacial Spike or Ray of Frost depending on what build you'll be going for, but those are not recommended at the moment. Windwalker Monks in the Shadowlands pre-patch will feel similar to their BFA version, and this includes their performance just as much as the being bullied part, which is a bit sad as I find their gameplays have a unique flow due to their mastery. There are a few minor changes which should make the spec feel even better, with the removal of the GCD from several buttons, alongside gaining Xu and baseline or even Expel harm. And while the spec didn't really benefit that much from corruptions, the removal didn't exactly put them in a great place in terms of performance. And with no significant power boost coming in the Shadowlands, that is given current tuning, there is no reason to believe that Windwalkers won't retain their below average performance in raids, pretty okay-ish performance in Mythic Plus, but still excellent for PvP. With no major changes done to the spec, they will likely keep struggling with scalability issues, making them gain less power from gear than other classes. After trying to crusade their way to even get to the middle of the pack in 8.3 performance, Red's current look isn't exactly different, nor will your gameplay be. There are indeed a few new talents, and specifically the interaction between Execution Sentence and Final Reckoning, which allows for some ridiculous burst setups, so I highly recommend having fun with them in PvP before they get nerfed to the ground and become unplayable, which is the usual Red lifecycle. This build is not really recommended in PvE as it performs about the same as the old Vision and Crusade combo, but requires perfect execution, making it harder to pull off and not worth it most of the time. While you get your auras back, they are pretty underwhelming, so don't get excited too much. Finally, avoid getting mastery, as with your traits being a great source of it, it's usually not worth to have any mastery anymore due to the secondary stat diminishing returns, and prepare to have an awkward gameplay experience due to not being able to use Hammer of Wrath during Wings, which is a baseline ability now by the way, as that possibility will only become available again in the form of a leveling upgrade in Shadowlands. Shadow Priests. After being mostly swept aside by the devs and having a rough ride in BFA in regards to their gameplay, your long lost tears will now pay off, as they've received a grand rework to the spec, starting with Void Form being now a cooldown and a 1 minute 30 timer. They look great, they feel great, they have different builds and synergies without needing any borrowed power, but on top of that they have outstanding performance as they are kings in the raid, great in Mythic Plus and absolute bullies in PvP, Battlegrounds most specifically. And you know what? Even cooler things await in the Shadowlands. The list is too big to go into detail, so if you ever wanted to check out Shadow Priest and possibly make it your new main, now's the time to do so, as they're looking great in the pre-patch and will likely stay that way in the future. With the Shadowlands pre-patch, there are a couple of tweaks to Assassination, although even with goodies such as Shiv, which is making a return, that one won't have its full potential before the new Shadowlands max level. The spec has had a solid core design with little reason to do a full revamp, so they received just a few changes which should still feel fresh when it comes to the gameplay pace, with the reintroduction of Slice and Dice or the possibility of using ambushes while out of stealth thanks to Blindside. While Assassination remains a viable spec, after being the way to go for most of BFA's content compared to other Rogue specs and their performances, this time around it's going to have to sit back and let its other specs take the front seat for now. I can however add as a bonus that with Assassination being the Master Poisoner spec, you can now have a permanent 47% healing reduction on your target thanks to an upgraded Wound Poison, which might prove to be quite powerful in PvP, or maybe even in some specific PvE encounter. Outlaw Rogues, also known as Pirate Rogues, were known as the kings of Mythic Plus in BFA, and in terms of raw performance in the pre-patch, things aren't looking much different aside from the fact that they're no longer going to be just a so-called dungeon spec, as they've become quite competitive in raids too. There are, however, a few things that will be different going forward, most notably the change to Blade Flurry, which is now a simple 30-second cooldown, poisons are now part of the spec too, Riposte is being changed into Evasion, as well as Between the Eyes being redesigned in a way that no longer stuns your target but instead applies a critical debuff on it, so no more random stuns and Sanguine pulls. Don't worry about not getting a stun, because you're getting Kidney Shot back. Overall, I would say that Outlaw has been quite improved in most aspects, and if you liked its previous iteration, you should enjoy the Shadowlands version even more, as it looks like it will become quite better in content other than just dungeons, thanks to that single target buff to your finisher, and with poisons being available, the spec can potentially find its place in PvP too. After being butchered by a nerf early on in BFA due to a way to cheese the mythic Zul encounter, the Subtlety spec got nerfed into a place that basically made it never recover until the very end of the expansion. I'm pleased to say that they're back in great fashion, as it's a rogue spec that many players wanted to play but never could, as it simply didn't perform. And honestly, the best part is yet to come, as even though it is performing decently in the pre-patch, it's missing a few great tools from the Shadowlands, which I expect those to make Subtlety into one of the best raiding but also PvP specs in the game. I doubt it, however, that it'll be just as strong in dungeons, but that shouldn't be too big of a problem knowing that you have a spec such as Outlaw for incredible dungeon performance. The biggest change to the spec is the change to Shadowlands, which now only has one charge but lasts for 8 seconds and a 1-minute cooldown, which gets reduced thanks to enveloping shadows, Nightblade being replaced by Rupture, and Find Weakness now being a spec passive, which also gets applied by backstab critical strikes. And lastly, poisons are now also part of your base toolkit, just like the other rogue specs. The Elemental Shaman is not that different in the Shadowlands pre-patch compared to Battle for Azeroth, as Blizzard's original plan of having Maelstrom as a resource removed has been reverted, thus leading to no major mechanical changes to the spec. There are however a couple of minor ones, such as learning how to play around the new talent called Echoing Shock. When it comes to performance, it's doing pretty well across the board, with a solid increase in all forms of content, as it didn't get hit by any big corruption removal downsides or nerfs. Aside from learning how to utilize that talent with its synergies, there are a few cool things coming for Elemental Shamans in Shadowlands, so if you like how the spec played before, you're probably going to love it when the expansion drops. Lastly, in the pre-patch you can currently do some juicy one-shots in PvP in combination with the Blood Major Essence and that Echoing Shock talent, so you should probably enjoy that while it lasts. Enhancement received a complete overhaul, which made your Maelstrom as a resource go away and is now replaced by Maelstrom weapon stacks, which leads to using instant casts of spells of your choice. I made a whole video about it on the channel, so you can check that one out to answer all of your enhancement questions. The gameplay has shifted away from a mostly Storm Strike spam and has instead moved to a nice mix of cooldown and GCD management. While Enhancement is currently underperforming, with balance being all over the place in the pre-patch, but mostly because of not having the tools it needs, as the spec changed from its BFA counterpart quite a bit and feels more like its pre-Legion version, but I would say that the gameplay itself has been improved by a lot. I expect it to become much better in the future, as it's currently missing leveling upgrades and was designed with the Shadowlands systems in mind, so its DPS numbers are not quite here at the moment, which is a shame. But hey, Windfury Totem is back, so you might be able to get a raid spot more easily now. However, you'll have to wait for the Shadowlands leveling upgrade to have its value bumped to 20%. Behold the kind of new Affliction Warlocks. Even though the spec had a very good performance in BFA, Destruction was even better, making it the most popular Warlock spec by far. After getting some great changes, which you can find out more about in a video I made on this channel, Affliction is now a powerhouse in all forms of content in the pre-patch and is likely going to stay that way in Shadowlands. The biggest change in terms of gameplay is that Unstable Affliction is no longer your soul shot spender, returning to its pre-Legion days of being just a simple dot that you keep on your focus target at all times. However, it can only be applied to one target at a time in PvE content. Your new soul shot spender is going to be Malefic Rapture, which is quite possibly the strongest shot spender the spec ever had. When you use this ability, it does damage to every target that you have a dot effect applied to and does increase damage for each dot on that target, which also means it's uncapped. This opens up the possibility of having great burst AoE as well as single target damage, as long as you'll have the time to set up your dots and shards. If you missed bullying people with dots, now is a great time to revisit the spec, as it's certainly going to be very popular in the near future and will remain extremely powerful. Greetings Demonology players, all three of you. I'm I'm sorry to say that there isn't that much love for you compared to the other specs, as it's going to feel pretty much the same in the pre-patch compared to the rest of BFA. With no major baseline changes outside of having a harder hitting uncapped implosion or having your axe thus finally acting like an interrupt, but even so it has some wonky interactions with stunnable and unstunnable targets. You'll find quite a few numerical buffs to many underused talents such as From the Shadows or Dreadlash, which might actually see play in the future, but overall you shouldn't have to adapt very much in preparation for Shadowlands. Currently, Demonology doesn't offer anything more powerful or useful than what the other two Warlock specs are already offering, as even being designed as a single target turret spec, it falls short in terms of performance and is likely to stay that way if they don't get at least some numerical balance love moving into Shadowlands. And now it's time for Destruction Warlocks. The Chaos Bolt monsters and kings of two-target fights, they will likely keep that niche alongside of still being great in raids and absolute bullies in PvP, but a bit worse in Mythic Plus. But that one might actually be changing, as they did receive quite a few tweaks in Shadowlands, making them a bit different than their BFA version. The biggest changes you'll see is the addition of Soulfire, which is basically a big incinerate that applies Immolate on a 45-second cooldown, Shadow Burn with an execute-like functionality, but most importantly, the addition of Reign of Chaos and Roaring Blaze, which opens up the possibility of doing big AoE bursts, which is something Destruction Warlocks were lacking in the past. So things are looking great for the future ahead, at least on paper. Previously, you basically just had the same talent build in every type of content, and it looks like Shadowlands will be able to turn that around, which should make things more interesting for the spec as well as increase its AoE viability. While Warriors received a lot of new buttons, with some cool new talents and a reworked mastery, as having 35% of your DPS come from a passive bleed that you'd never notice wasn't exactly very fun for most. You can find out more in the Arms Warrior video I made on the channel. The Azerite trait Test of Might remains too strong in the pre-patch in combination with the Lucid Dreams essence, leading to a gameplay experience feeling similar to how it worked in 8.3. You're also going to be using as much rage as possible during those Colossus Smash windows, only this time you'll sadly be performing much worse, as without the insane amounts of haste you could have thanks to corruptions, as well as raid encounters being too short, which leads to shorter execute phases, your raw DPS will take a bit of a hit. While it is usually better than Fury in single target, it struggles in AoE Mythic Plus performance, where Fury has an advantage, but putting the raw DPS aside, if you ever wanted to get back into an Arms Warrior, I highly recommend doing so, as they should be much cooler to play in Shadowlands than they were in BFA, especially in PvP, thanks to things like Shattering Throw and Spell Reflect being based on abilities alongside an increased duration on the Sharpened Blade debuff. While the already solid core of Fury Warrior gameplay is basically the same, the biggest change for most is likely going to be the return of single-minded Fury, allowing Fury Warriors to once again dual-wield one-handed weapons, and aside from that, there are a few new and redesigned talents that might add some spices to the mix, such as an upgraded Recklessness cooldown. On top of that, they are getting the same additional baseline warrior abilities such as Spell Reflect or Ignore Pain. Fury Warriors currently look better in cleave scenarios compared to their Arms counterpart in the pre-patch, mostly due to stat scaling and increased rage generation thanks to Azerite traits, allowing you to use Rampage and maintain rage much more frequently. I feel like a vast majority of those changes are positive and makes Fury Warrior a well-designed spec. However, I expect the systems of Shadowlands to help them out quite heavily. this should now cover all of the DPS specializations in the game. Please remember that no matter the spec you'll choose, you will do just fine in all forms of content in this wacky pre-patch period, which actually won't last as long as I expected it, due to the game releasing on the 23rd of November. As a reminder, the Scourge and pre-expansion events will launch on the 10th of November, which should allow you to fully gear a fresh character with an equivalent of normal Nihilotha item level gear, making it viable enough to have fun and experiment with new specs and classes, which I highly recommend doing with the recently revamped leveling system. Shown on screen were the final rankings of all specs in comparison to each other in the pre-patch, as well as the 8.3 version for raiding and Mythic Plus. Data was taken from sites such as warcraftlogs.com, raider.io and bench.me to see how things changed up with the introduction of the pre-patch. For Mythic Plus, I calculated the average top 20 scores of those respective specs to create an estimated number for those that enjoy those. But please, remember to treat pre-patch Mythic Plus data with an enormous bag of salt, as most of the good players are not engaged in doing high keys at the moment, making this data probably not accurate nor representative. It is how it is. If you'd like to ask class-specific questions, I gathered a few friends and class experts in my Discord, or will be trying to help out those that are looking for class guidance and advice in the future. Lastly, I would like to thank all the great players that helped me in creating this video, as well as all the folks from the OYOE gaming community, which is a place where gamers of all kinds can get together and enjoy all things gaming. If you want to find out more about them, you can find the links to their socials in the description below, and I'll see you guys on Twitch or on the next one. Goodbye.